Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, amen. And direct, O Lord, all our actions by thy holy inspirations, and carry them on by thy gracious assistance, so that every prayer and work of ours may begin from thee and by thee, be happening through Christ our Lord. Amen. Virgin most prudent, pray for us. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, amen. Okay, so this conference is on detraction. And I've talked quite a few times about detraction in other locations, but we'll go into it a little deeper, talk about various aspects of it. So sometimes you'll see detraction, and especially like if you read it in St. Thomas's Summa in English, it'll come back as backbiting. So in relationship to detraction is normally speaking distinguished from other sins of the tongue in the sense that detraction is usually saying something that's true, but it's done in order to harm a person's good name. And the goal, usually the intention, is so that those who hear it will think badly of the one that you're speaking about. And so that's basic. So detraction is saying something true in order to hurt someone's good name or reputation. So that's actually the actual goal of it. It's different from lying or saying something false. That's calumny, which is when you say something false against somebody. Murmuring is when you talk behind, or you talk quietly, and it's the emphasis on that. Murmuring is it can be true or false, but its really ultimate thing is to destroy someone's reputation. It's not usually said among other people, other than just like one or two people at the most. Something that's contumacious, when you say something that destroys someone's reputation or is against someone's good name to their face. So those are the differences that you'll see. But detraction is saying something true that reduces someone's good name or harms their good name. So you can hurt someone's good name either directly or indirectly. It can be directly in 4 ways, St. Thomas says. The first is by saying that which is false about him, although normally, as I mentioned, you can lessen their good name, something that's false. So in that particular case, you're talking about calumny. Secondly, by stating his sin to be greater than it is, so you exaggerate it. Okay. The third is by revealing something unknown about him, so revealing something that other people don't know. And fourth, by ascribing his good deeds to a bad intention. So he did this because he's just out for money, etc. You can hurt someone's good name indirectly, and this is either by speaking against his good, or by maliciously concealing it, or by diminishing it. So in other words, you speak about some particular good thing that he actually has, some good aspect of his, or you conceal it in such a way so you don't let other people know. Maliciously means that you do it in such a way so that other people won't know that he's actually good. You kind of see all this stuff actually in politics, right now. And then, or by diminishing it. Oh yeah, he did this, but it's not as good as you'd like to think it is. Okay. So these are the ways in which you can actually do it. But by detraction, you're saying something true about the person in order to bring down their people's estimation of them. St. Thomas asks the question, is it grave matter to detract? And he says, it is a grave matter to blacken a man's good name, because of all the temporal things that a man has, his name is the most precious, he said. So if you look at all the different exterior goods that we have, whether it's our possessions, our job, our things, and our good name, etc., our good name is actually the thing that is considered the highest of the exterior goods. And so it is written in Ecclesiastes, take care of a good name, for this shall continue with thee more than 1,000 treasures, precious and great. Okay. In fact, historically, it was by your good name that you could actually even do any kind of business interaction, although today that's not necessarily the case. Hence, detraction, properly speaking, St. Thomas says, is a mortal sin if you're destroying someone's name. However, he says, it may be venial if it's done if one of the following is the case. one is done from a light motive. That is, you're not out to maliciously hurt his name. You're not out to crush him, etc. But you're just saying it because you just don't want people liking him or something. You might say something that's true that's harmful of the person's name, but your intention is not to actually harm his name, right? It's not so much to harm his name as to inform the person about them. And the last one is the nature of what is said is only lightly or not seriously harmful to the person's reputation. So normally speaking, detraction is going to be venial, but it can be mortal if it causes grave harm to someone's name in some fashion. The entire moral tradition says that if you detract against somebody and affect their name in a way that's unjust or undue, then in that particular case you have an obligation to restore the man his good name, no less than you would have to as if you had taken something from him. So it's part of restitution. So if you say something true about somebody that hurts their reputation, you may have to actually go back to the people and say, hey, look, I shouldn't have said that, even though it's true, I shouldn't have said that, and let's keep it quiet, etc. Or if you did it in such a way that you would have to make restitution if your intention was to actually cause the person serious harm in that regard. Even you would have to actually do it. Now, detraction, you'd have to make the restitution. Detraction is not normally speaking public, usually that's also part of contumely when it's public, because contumely can be both true or false when you're trying to destroy someone's reputation, usually to their face or in public. And so in that particular way, if the destruction of the person's name is public, then the restitution has to be public. If it's just done in private, then it's only done. You just have to correct or inform the people that you have discussed it with. It is not detraction to reveal a man's hidden sin in order that he may mend his life. So whether one denounces it or accuses him for the good of public justice. Okay, let's unpack those a little bit. Sometimes you may have to say something that's actually true. So, for example, if there's like 5 of you sitting around and somebody says something or does something and you state something to the effect of I've noticed that you have a difficulty and even though it's in front of other people, you point out some particular aspect of the person's character that's flawed. I notice you talk too much. Or something like that. Or I notice that when it comes to other people, you never have anything positive to say. As long as it's done with charity and justice and it's not exaggerated, and if it's done so that the person will actually amend their life, then it's not strictly speaking detraction, because detraction has those 2 elements. It has to be true, but then normally speaking, and then it has to be such that it's to take away from the person's reputation. And in this particular case, you're not so much looking to take away from the person's name as you are to trying to get them to amend their life. Okay. So you can say something that's hidden. There might be circumstances too where, like for example, if you notice, say someone in someone's family is doing something that's particularly bad, you may have to go to one of the other family members and say, hey, look, I don't know if you're aware of this, but this is what's going on with little Johnny, right? And so, and that wouldn't be detraction either, because you're doing it so that his issues can be addressed. Okay. Then, whether one denounce it or accuse him for the good of public justice. There are times when we actually need to say something because people are believing something about somebody that's actually not true. They don't have a right to that good reputation, and it's actually going to cause the person who thinks it harm. So we may have to tell them, I would, like, for example, someone says, "Oh, we're going to go see Joe Biden today." You might tell them, "Look, I make sure your wife keeps out of arm's distance with him, right? Or your 8-year-old daughter, make sure you keep her behind you at all times, because he's known to go around sniffing girls' hair or what have you." Okay, so this is public knowledge, but it's something in order to keep the person from actually suffering some type of good in relationship to it. So it's there might be other times too where if you find out, for example, like if Bill Gates is doing something that's immoral, which is shocking, I realize, but nevertheless, if he were to do something immoral with his billions of dollars, then the person who has done the proper research and can verify the facts of the case, if the common good would be harmed by him not saying something, then he would have an obligation to actually say this bad thing that Bill Gates is actually doing, okay, or any other public official for that matter. Because if it is causing harm to the common good and he doesn't say anything, then he is an accomplice to that and he becomes culpable for it. So he might actually have to say something in order for the sake of the common good, that is public justice. So there are times too when we would have to say something. So for example, suppose you had a daughter who started dating some guy and you knew this guy, and it wasn't public knowledge that this guy was not a good guy. He was into all sorts of weird stuff and he was a bad guy, etc. Then you going to your daughter and saying, "Hey, look, you need to be aware of the fact that he's involved with this, 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 and this." And that is not detraction, because even though it does take away from his reputation, he doesn't have a right to the reputation, because in justice we have a right to a reputation that's proportionate to our good character. So if we don't have good character, well, then we're not entitled to a good reputation, right? Whereas if and so in that particular case, you could actually say something to the daughter. You have an obligation to actually say it. A man's reputation or good name is an external good, and so it is not the worst sin to detract. So there's 3 kinds of goods: goods of the soul, goods of the body, and goods are external goods. The Latin phrase for that is juxtanos, those things that are connected to us or aside from us. Our good name is something that's external to us, and so as a result, it's if somebody destroys it, that's not the worst thing that could actually happen to us. Obviously, something that would affect our soul would be far worse. However, among the exterior goods, it is among the worst because of the fact that his good name, number of things hinge upon his good name. One, just people's estimation of him. He has a right to a just estimation. So if you say something false against somebody, then, or once in a while, there might be something that's actually true that, say, someone has done that was involved in X, Y, and Z, but actually had repented and had stopped doing that and had actually amended his life. So there's a particular Catholic public figure that was involved in homosexuality when he was younger. The diocese that he was in, they didn't like him, so they basically accused him of this past homosexuality, which he ended up admitting to. Yeah, that's actually true, but I've amended my life and I'm living a chaste life. The diocese had no right to ruin his reputation because of his amendment of life. So in that particular case, they didn't have a right to do that. But then there's also, it's also one of the reputation is not just because of what people think of us, but it also affects our relationships with other people. It affects, in some cases, our ability to engage in business affairs, to get jobs, or things of this sort. It can also be the type of thing that when a person is thinking about when they're going to say something bad about somebody to someone else, is this going to cause damage to charity in the end? In other words, is there a proportion between the evil that the person's done and the charity that you're trying to actually preserve? Because if it's the type of thing that if you say this and it's just going to destroy charity, even though it's true, then there's a bit of a problem. Okay. So this just gives you a basic outline of detraction. Again, it's saying something true in order to harm someone's reputation or good name. Should we listen to people who detract? Well, St. Thomas says, if a person is detracting and we listen to it without resisting, if we're talking about authentic detraction, here we're not talking about someone who's actually informing us about something that we actually need to know or something like that. Then in that particular case, if they actually are detracting, then St. Thomas says we participate in their sin. But we also have to be careful not to induce other people to detract. Because sometimes people actually know the dirt on a particular individual, and so they'll start asking probing questions about the person because they want to know the dirt. And if it doesn't meet this criteria, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, if it doesn't meet that criteria, then we are basically being the cause of their sin by an incitement. So we have to be careful about that. If we listen to a person detract, if it's something that's grave, if the listener hates the one who's being detracted against, that is, the sin can be grave if the listener hates the one who's being detracted against, or the content is grave by its nature. One would have a duty to correct the detractor when it's grave. When it's venial, you just have to kind of look at the circumstances. Because as the moralists say, when it comes to correcting people, we have an obligation when it's grave matter. And it's, that's other circumstances that we know the person is actually going to take the correction and the circumstances are right, etc. Okay. On the other hand, if it's just venial, the moralists are pretty consistent saying if you corrected everybody for everything that was venially sinful, you'd be correcting everybody all the time. And so they said that would just destroy charity. So they would say in that particular case, you're not necessarily bound unless the circumstances were right. But the degree of sin that we get in listening to people detract is that sin that we have in that, listening to that detraction, is dependent upon the gravity of what is spoken. So if it's gravely sinful, then by listening to it, it's grave matter. If it's not gravely sinful, then it's not. Now, it doesn't mean, by gravely sinful, we don't necessarily mean that what is revealed about the person is that they've done something that's gravely disordered or sinful. That can be the case, right? But sometimes these things are publicly known. So, for example, in the relationship to most politicians, we catch wind of all sorts of crimes and treason and violations of the Sixth Commandment and things like that. And so talking about those is more on the level of venial sin if you don't have a certain set of criteria than it is mortal, even though what they've done is grave matter. Whereas if the person, if the type of thing is, like I said, if the person's a public figure, he's actually made amendment of life, or he's stopped doing that behavior, and then you reveal it, then that's grave matter, and we shouldn't listen to that. What happens if you're detracted against? Okay, well, Christ himself said, that they will revile you, etc., and that he said, and always remember, they hated me first. So the fact of the matter is that if you're good, those who are evil are going to detract against you, or actually, usually in most cases, it's going to be contumacious, where they're saying things that are completely false, that have nothing to do with anything. But we have to remember that usually that's a call on the side of God for us to develop certain virtues. The first is patience. Obviously, because patience is suffering evil things, that is enduring it with equanimity. And so when people detract against our good name, there should be a certain kind of equanimity when we see that. You have to have detachment from your own good name, so that's the other virtues, becoming detached from it. We do have to take means to preserve our good name, but those means have to be proportionate. They shouldn't be extreme. We shouldn't go to extremes in trying to maintain our good name. But we should have certain detract, but we should try and also maintain it, which means at times we should defend ourselves. Other times, if it serves charity or our own growth in virtue, it's actually better not to do what's necessary to preserve our own name if people have detracted against. Now, sometimes you may have to stop people detracting against you just because it's starting to affect charity, like within the home or outside or, in your community or what have you, okay? So then the question becomes, so does that mean anytime you say something true about somebody and it harms their reputation, that it's detraction? Or to ask it another way, can I say something bad about somebody? Because you'll get these people who are a little Pollyannish, and their basic attitude is, you should never say anything bad about anybody. Well, if you're talking about the dead, that's a good idea. But if you're not talking about the dead, that's not a good idea. And even the dead, you still might have to at times. The point being is that there are times in which we should say things because of the fact that it's necessary for other people. So we want to make sure that we understand what those conditions are for when we can say something bad about somebody. And then if those conditions are in place, then it's not actually a case of detraction. Okay. So the first is that what we say has to be just. It has to be true, in other words. It shouldn't be no more and no less than the reality of the situation. So if some guy you find out happens to fall in a relationship with the Sixth Commandment with one woman, you don't go around telling everybody that, he is completely out of control in this area. He's, you better watch your daughters and all this, in other words, or just saying that he's a philanderer or this or that. That may or may not be the case. So, in other words, it should be just proportionate. And so basically, if the guy falls and it's not public knowledge and it's not necessary to know and you go around telling people, that's a problem. Unless all of a sudden he starts dating some guy's daughter, you may have to go and say, hey, look, I know about this. You better protect your daughter from this guy, okay? Or make sure that he is going to follow the rules of courtship in relationship to her very strictly, okay? So it has to be just, which means it's neither greater nor less than it is. You have to be really careful about the slippery slope where listening to or detracting or saying things damaging about people is true, because in other words, you don't want to get to the point where you're talking about it too much in relationship to people being bad, because it can slowly lead to asserting things that are uncertain or not true that are damaging. We've all seen this where we've been sitting in a conversation and something will come up about what somebody actually did. Now, it may or may not be necessary conversation that we actually need to know this or what have you. But let's just say for the sake of argument, it should be you state it, it's done, and then you move on. There should be detachment from stating things that are bad about people or detracting against people or saying, there should be complete detachment about that. In fact, ultimately, if our interior lives are properly ordered, it should kind of pain us. It should pain us to actually have to say something bad about somebody, right? Whereas if we're just constantly talking about how bad they are, then that becomes a problem. You see this among certain traditionalists in discussion of priests and bishops and the Pope. Okay. The priests, if you talk to a traditional priest, most traditional priests who have been ordained for 10 to 20 years will basically have at least one story where someone was either contumacious usually, but has damaged their reputation or spoken against them. And sometimes the priest might just have just been ordained 15 minutes before, steps up to the pulpit, although it'd be a little bit more than 15 minutes, but he steps up to the pulpit and the guy hasn't even opened his mouth and people are already bad-mouthing him. You see this all the time, right? And so this is something which is probably more contumely than detraction, but people will detract against the priest. If you see a defect in the priest, you should be praying for him. I said this, you've heard me say this before, 5 years ago I predicted that if people didn't stop receiving communion in the state of mortal sin, that if they don't stop that God was going to take from them their ability to receive basically strip them of their access to the sacraments. Well, that's what happened with COVID. I had no idea that was going to be the form of it, but there it is. And I'm just unpacking the logic of it. It's the same thing with the priests. If the lay people don't stop attacking the clergy, then what's going to happen is God's going to take it from you, because that's what he always does. And that means we're going to go through a period where, and it could be fairly soon, where you won't have regular access to a priest. So this is something to always bear in mind. People are constantly detracting against the bishops. I think that collectively, as the bishops collectively are a hapless group, virtually nothing ever gets done. As individuals, a lot of times in their own individual dioceses, some of them are actually doing some good things. Some of them are just bad administrators. They might be guys that, if they weren't administrators, they'd actually be pretty decent fellows. But they're not, because of the fact that they're bad administrators. So once they get out, then they're actually turn out to be not that. Once they stop being a bishop, they actually kind of revert back to being a decent individual. But the point being with the bishops is that we have to be careful not to be exaggerating those things, as I mentioned in the prior conference. Also, there are things that happen in relationship to bishops and even the Pope where we don't have certitude about some of this. Now, with the Holy Father, over the course of time, we started to gain a certain amount of certitude about some of the things that he said and holds and things of that sort. But in the very beginning, it's hard to know because, again, a lot of this is being reported by the mainstream news media, who we know habitually lie to us and therefore cannot be trusted in any sense whatsoever. And so if they're reporting this stuff from the Pope, then we have to take it with a grain of salt until it can be verified. So, but you have to also remember, one of the things that it is useless to detract, basically, is what I'm saying. It's useless to detract against those who lead you, your leaders, because you deserve them. This is what most people don't seem to grasp, is that, okay, there are a lot of good Catholics, and there's not a lot, I would say. There's a fair number of good Catholics. People who are trying to lead an authentic, good Catholic life, they're trying to grow holy, they're trying to avoid sin and things like that. But the fact of the matter is that a vast majority of the Catholics are leading lives of habitual mortal sin. And as a result of that, they cannot expect the priests, the bishops, and the Pope to be men of outstanding character, because that's not the leaders that you actually deserve. Okay, so it is better to straighten out your own behavior first so that you can merit good leaders rather than going around detracting against them all the time. People actually make a living off of detracting against the Holy Father or the bishops, and and people say, well, other people need to know. Okay, there's ways of doing that. It's true. I do think that people need to know if a bishop or a pope were to say something that's contrary to the faith, and people heard it. It should be informed, but it should be educational and informative, and not hypercritical. And it shouldn't be with animus and detestation. Like throw the bum out. It should be, look, this is what the church teaches us. We can't believe this because of this, that, and the other thing. It should be informative, rather than actually just going after them. Okay, so the first thing is it has to be just, which means it has to be true. Okay. Also be careful of the person who says to you, I'm telling this so that you can pray for this person. You're gossiping is all it is. A lot of times you're just detracting, so I don't need to hear this. Right? You also should not take delight in the loss of the good name of another person, even though that may be happening, because it's a true evil that this person is losing their good reputation. Although there is a good that's come from it in the sense it can be just, but also that other people would be informed. But it shouldn't be that this person somehow suffers detriment, because that's contrary to charity. Okay. The next one is it has to therefore proceed from charity. So in other words, if you're going to say something bad about one person to another person, it has to be done either for the good of the one who is being spoken about. I'm doing this for his own benefit, right? Or it has to be done for the good of the one who hears it. And here we're talking about good. We mean spirit, that we're looking at what's spiritually best for them. It's not just so that they can, feel smug and confirmed in their distaste for, say, someone like Hillary Clinton or something like that. It has to be something which is that this person, I'm saying this so that this person will grow in their own spiritual life. That will eliminate a vast majority of us speaking badly about most people, because most people, they just, they're simply not, there's two parts of it. They're simply not worth the time and spending in talking about, most of them to begin with. In fact, I have a basic theory. At some point I'm going to do a conference on government. But, when we talk about our government officials, and we're talking about them on a regular basis, this is an indicator not only that we're paying too much attention to them, and they shouldn't deserve that much of our mental energy, but the other part of it is it's an indicator that the government is way too involved in our lives. Historically, for example, if you looked at your average peasant in the medieval period, they would know probably the name of the king, and they would know the name of the pope, but they probably never heard hardly anything they ever said or did. And it didn't affect their life as a peasant or as a countryman, and it did not affect, in relationship to the pope, it didn't affect their Catholic living or their Catholic life. The fact that when the pope sneezes, we all know about it is a little ridiculous. But it's the same thing even in relationship to public officials. The fact that we live in a system where, I don't know if it's coming from the government itself or from individuals who stand to profit by it, but the people who own the mainstream media make sure that we hear about the government officials non-stop, good, bad, or ugly, non-stop. That's all, it's like 60% of the news. That's all we hear. And then the other percentage is just various sundries. But it's just non-stop. I generally speak, and what this tells you is that the government, people actually think the government's that important, that it should be that much in our lives. We shouldn't even have to be worrying about detraction against our civil authorities because of the fact that we shouldn't even be that aware of them, frankly, because they shouldn't have to be doing this much. They shouldn't have to be exercising this amount of governance by passing this number of laws, right? Okay. But anyway, that all being said is that I think that one of the most effective things that could happen in relationship to the government is if we just stopped paying attention to them. But anyway, okay, that being said. So this is something to just kind of keep in mind, that we should basically, if it's not good for the person who's going to hear it, then don't say it, right? If it's just to engage in chatter so that you can kind of feel good about, feel confirmed in the fact that you feel bad about somebody, or that it's good that other people see the same thing that I see. Well, it's one thing if you're talking about it on an intellectual level for constructive purposes. It's another if you're just dragging all the public politicians or public personae through the dirt just to make yourself feel better. That's a sign of malice, and we have to be careful with that. The last condition is it has to be necessary. And this is the one that is not the case most of the time. This is the condition that most people do not meet. It is necessary when the person hearing it either needs to be affirmed in something that is true, that's necessary for their spiritual life or for their living of a rightly ordered life, and the person does not know the truth about someone but needs to know. They do need to know this on some level, right? So I'm not suggesting that you can't talk about politicians from time to time, and I'm not suggesting that you can't talk about some of the things that they're actually doing, but it has to be, you have to avoid taking delight in maligning them and things of that sort, but you also have to say only what's necessary. So if you're going to talk about somebody, we say, well, there's this, and then you just leave it, no more, no less. Most people sin by excess in this area. That is, they talk more than they actually should in relationship to this. If everybody knows something bad about someone, there is no need to talk about it unless one is helping the other people to process it, that is, to understand it properly or how we can actually address it. But in that case, you have to be careful not to let it degenerate into just bashing the people. Once it is mentioned when necessary, there's no reason to continue talking about it. Unless if it comes back up again in relationship to something else that needs to be talked about, then fine. But you have to be careful about just talking about all the bad stuff because it just feeds the disordered appetites. In other words, it erodes charity. Sometimes it is necessary, since a person should not have a good name, because it is through the good name that he is causing the harm. This is one of the things we see in relationship to the politicians. So I'm not suggesting, for example, that certain people shouldn't publicly be drawing out or informing other people about, or, as the elections come up, we don't talk about various politicians in order to discuss and come to know their reputation, because a lot of times it's because the evil that they are, the bad person that they actually are, is being hidden in order so that the person can get into office. So, in fact, I found it hilarious that when Bill Clinton was running for office, they said, it's not a man's moral character that's issue, it's how he's going to govern. Well, I'm just like, well, excuse me, but the governance a guy engages in, which we saw right with Bill Clinton, is entirely dependent upon his moral character. So because it's all governed by prudence, and prudence is a moral virtue. So if the guy has no prudence in his normal day-to-day life, he's not going to have prudence in running a government, right? So, or if he is, it's going to be somewhat compromised. Okay, so we can talk about those things beforehand. People can even talk about it, even if it's going to cause harm. It is true that sometimes it's necessary to keep people informed. Sometimes you have to kind of lay it out. Well, we know this guy did this, and this guy did that, and this guy did this, and this is one of the reasons why when we say that, many government officials are involved in child trafficking or something like that, that we actually can have ostensible examples for that. Okay. And now some counsels before we open up for questions. Saying bad things about someone should not be a matter of course. We shouldn't just do it all the time and just think it's okay, but done infrequently due to the necessity not being in most cases. You can spend 10 minutes on any kind of decent news website and know 90% of the dirt that's out there, right? That's publicly accessible. Doesn't mean that there's not other dirt that but the fact that some people will dig and dig and dig and dig in order to find stuff online is a bit of a problem. Be careful to check the appetites and not let it degenerate into malice or ill will or delight in the other's loss of a good name. In other words, you have to be careful not to habituate the lower faculties in delight in evil. This is what we have to really kind of avoid, because that's going to chisel away at our own benevolence, that is goodwill. Avoid negativity as a general rule. Avoid drawing others into detraction. Sometimes traditionalists can be so focused on finding fault as they are trying to preserve their faith. I get it. Most traditionalists have fought, at least it was true in the past. I think it's a little bit different now. The demographics are starting to change. But most people in the past had to fight for their faith. And so they were, to fight for your faith, you have to keep constant vigilance, and you're looking out for stuff that's bad that could harm the thing. And so eventually people get to the point where their focus is entirely negative. And so even when they're in a traditional parish, that still is their focus because they're in these habits. And I'm not hacking entirely the traditionalists. Part of this is actually to be laid at the feet of the magisterium. If the magisterium had its act together and was cleaning up the church, then people would feel less attacked and be less inclined towards that kind of constantly looking at fault at everything. But the problem is it can become the focus in the end rather than the good. So detraction can be a sign of the faculties being focused on evil rather than the good. So if you find yourself really inclined to do detracting, that's a sign that your real focus is not God, it's on evil things. And then lastly and above this, charity above all. We just have to really work on charity to make sure that we're doing everything for the love of God and for the love of our neighbors so that they can advance in holiness. Okay. Any questions? It's pretty clear. It's pretty brutal. Because I think most people are guilty of lots of detraction.
How does that work out in families? You're talking more about
The principles are still the same, that it's just, it's not worse than it is, not worse or less than it is. that it proceeds from charity. You're talking about because you want what's best for the persons, and that it's actually necessary, right? So in a family, I find that the principle is still obtained. You might be talking a little bit more about it because you're dealing with it and you're actually approaching it. Whereas, maybe talking about the politicians, maybe less. But in the family, so you might talk a little bit more about it, but it should be something which is, if there's somebody who has a problem, it's acknowledged and then it's addressed, but then you only talk about it when it's necessary.
So, Father, when you have a new pastor, and the pastor is saying things that are making statements that are not prudent, talking about things outside of his authority, making decisions within the parish that are imprudent, how do you address that with other parishioners and not create a situation of detraction? How do you talk about that together so that you can try to find a solution or a way forward, or encourage each other and help the pastor?
Well, I think it's one of those things that once the problem's recognized, and if you see that somebody else recognizes the problem, and then that's when you would actually discuss it with them. Okay. And you discuss, obviously, I think the real issue is on the amount of discussion in those cases. So you would discuss it, and you may need to discuss it, especially if he's saying stuff contrary to the faith or stuff that's just like, well, he really doesn't have the authority to do that. You have to look to see do I need to say, on the side of the necessity, is it necessary for this person to actually know for them to continue leading a good Catholic life? Because if it's not, then I don't necessarily need to say anything. On the other hand, if it's a thing where the parish is starting to kind of go down, then you may need to discuss it with them. But it's the amount of the discussion should be only what's necessary in order to arrive at the resolution or solution to the problem. And then after that, you have to kind of cut it off, because otherwise it'll just sit and fester. Which sometimes is hard. It makes it difficult.
Oh, good, yeah. You might have covered this, but this has to do with, like, the principle of correcting people in public. Like, if you have a class or someone's at work, there's, like, this habit of going around and making examples of people and that kind of thing. And I think what you're saying is you should only do that if it's for the good of, well, how would you put that? So everyone can learn a lesson, or it's for their good, or...
Well, there are ways to... the real question is not so much in correcting the person, because you probably would need to if the person's saying something that's wrong or what have you. But what you have to do, it's how you actually do it. So rather than saying, well, obviously you have a moral issue in this particular area, you would only proceed to something like that if it was of the gravest necessity. Otherwise, you would just simply address, well, some people think this, but in point in fact, the church has always taught this, and this is why we have to avoid this and that. So you can correct them indirectly.
Right.
When it's in public, a lot of times that's better. Sometimes it's better just if the other people in the group already know what the truth is, then you just say, well, come talk to me afterwards. So it's just a matter of the how. Yes.
Is it ever
What about with the church, though, Father, and all of the bad things we hear that are happening?
The principles are still the same. I think it's the same thing. I think the thing to do is just not be paying much attention to it, lead your Catholic lives, and only talk about it when it's necessary.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes, you had a question?
Yes. Is it ever a sin for the person who knows concretely some information about a person and just not to get involved with it?
It would only be sinful if it was some form of negligence, that you should have done something in order to cause other people from getting harmed or something of that sort. Sometimes it can also be the case of if there's nothing that you can do about it, well, then you're not obligated to get involved.
So if they're not under your authority, you don't have to do anything about it?
Well, if you're talking about correcting a situation, yes. If you're talking about informing other people, it just, again, would depend on, is it necessary, etc. So it'd be circumstantial. So, Okay. Yeah.
So if, for example, your child has been approached inappropriately by a man,
Right.
and you just didn't tell the other parents about this man who gets very involved with families, but you just kept that to yourself.
That would be negligence, yeah.
Okay.
So, but there would be, on the other hand, if the family that you're going to inform isn't going to listen to you, you wouldn't have to. On the other hand, if it's the type of thing is that, no, they need to know this, because if they did know
and
this.
you observe.
Yeah,
thinking, there's, things are happening with their boy.
Right, exactly. Yeah,
You need to
exactly.
say something.
Yeah, then you'd be obligated to say something.
Okay.
So, okay. All right, if you'll kneel, I'll give you a blessing. Benedictio Dei omnipotentis, Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, super vos et semper. Amen.